Good morning to everyone. My name is Paul Struck, and I'm an Industry Practice Director at Yash Technologies. I'd like to welcome you all today to our webcast, FSMA, The FDA is Ready, Are You?, in which you will receive an overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act and why it's important to you and your business, how you can meet the compliance requirements for it, as well as view our live demo of the track and trace functionality within Yash's CPG One, our SAP Business all-in-one solution. Our presenters today are Steve Phelan, Industry Principal for Consumer Products at SAP, and Dan Cervenka, a Senior Solutions Engineer here at Yash Technologies. Steve's been with SAP since 2010 and is a leading expert on software for consumer product manufacturers. Dan has over 40 years of experience in the manufacturing and distribution industries, helping companies of all sizes use information technology to streamline their business processes. Without further ado, I'd like to present our key speaker for today's event, Mr. Steve Phelan.
Good morning, everyone. Today we've got several points for discussion. They all revolve around the Food Safety Modernization Act, and I'd like to first lay out the main points we're going to be spending time on. We're going to start with the SAP point of view, and basically we simply want to tell you what we believe are the key provisions of the Food Safety Modernization Act, what we believe are realistic penalties for noncompliance, and how we might be able to help you navigate through the Food Safety Modernization Act maze. Second, relatively briefly, we will spend some time on preparing. That is, what you need to do to get your computer systems, particularly SAP, but not necessarily SAP, cleaned up and ready to go, so that as you begin work on compliance, you'll have everything you need already in place. Third, and where we'll spend most of our time today, we want to look at how you can track and trace lots of product, batches of product, through the system from farm to fork, being sure that you collect all the data you need to report to the FDA, and also everything you need in the event of a recall. You know what's going to happen sooner or later. You want to be ready to go. You want to be able to tell the FDA exactly what they need to know in the case of a serious recall, of which there have been several in recent years. We'll look at actually two different systems there. One will be a live demo, one will be a description. We'll compare and contrast the two to be sure you understand what's available right now. Because that particular part was called out in the actual Food Safety Act itself, not just in the regulations the FDA is issuing, we consider that to be particularly important and one of the very first things you'll want to do. Fourth, we'll mention briefly analytics and reporting to be sure that you understand that there is going to be a lot of reporting involved. The FDA is going to want reports. They're going to want quality reports. They're going to want tracking reports. They're going to want quite a lot of stuff there. And we want to be sure that you're ready for that as well. Next, we'll talk about some of the underlying requirements that you have to be sure are in order, and most particularly, your quality management system. Be sure that you understand that there have been some changes in the law there as well, and that you're prepared for that. And finally, we'll spend just a couple of minutes on mobility. There's nothing in the law that requires that, but we think you could make your lives a lot easier if you did some of this stuff on mobile devices. Next slide, please. So let's start then with our point of view. Go ahead to the next slide again. What's different now than in the past? Well, essentially, the new regulatory environment involves a major shift from an advisory recall, where the FDA sort of puts an arm lock on you and says you got to bring this stuff back, to active regulatory management, trying to prevent the source of recalls in the first place. And the FDA has a lot of new tools and a lot of new power to enforce what they feel is necessary, not just advise you as to what you ought to do. I'm sure most of you have heard about the suspension of someone's license to operate as a food facility in November, late November. It was really kind of shocking to a lot of people involved in it, because after some warnings and recall for 240 different products, the FDA gave 24 hours notice to shut down the plant. And as you can see there, There were a number of reasons to do that, and they simply were not willing to wait any longer. This is a lot different from the way it used to be. We believe this was, of course, the cannon shot across the bow of the industry to say, look, the regime has changed. And it's not going to be the way it used to be. There are going to be different ways to handle this stuff. And that is simply the first of what we believe will be several different things that you will be seeing that will affect you. Next slide, please. This should give you an idea of some of the areas where we believe that computer software and technology can be helpful to you. On this slide in particular, you see some of the things called out in red and some in black. That's not exactly in order of importance, simply that technology is helpful in the ones in red. I've already mentioned to a limited degree the first of those, that is record keeping and document management. There are a lot of new requirements for records, and you want to be sure that you're keeping them. As the regulations come out, you'll find that there are a number of different kinds of data you have to keep that you didn't have to keep before. And they've got to be accessible and available quickly. And that sort of goes along with what we said earlier about reporting. You need to have the data under the covers, and then you have to be able to report on it fairly quickly. Allergen management has always been part of the law. However, there are new requirements there, particularly sanitation programs supporting product labeling and others of that kind. That involves additional records, additional testing, a number of things that you're going to have to be aware of as well. Where we'll be spending most of our time today is track and trace. The Act itself provided for a traceability pilot program, not just the regulations the FDA is delivering. And the FDA, as one of its very first orders of business under Fsma, ran a pilot program for tracking and tracing to be sure that it was possible to do what they wanted to do. And the answer was, yes, it is possible. Modern computer systems can handle that stuff. So you'll be seeing that in a fair amount of detail. And part of that, of course, and the reason for the track and trace to a large degree, is the ability to recall a product when something does go wrong. The intent is to prevent things from going wrong in the first place, but we know that it's going to happen sooner or later under some circumstances. So the FDA wants to be sure that they can pull products from farm to fork at any point through that chain. Hopefully, the earlier the better, so that it doesn't actually get in consumer hands. And if, in fact, that can be done, then it will be a success. And finally, another one of the new requirements is the safe harvest standards. Those regulations were just posted yesterday, I believe it was, available for public comment now. So we have more information than we had before. And that goes all the way back to the farm itself. A lot of things that will have to be done differently at the farm, and then after that, throughout the entire food chain. Next slide, please. There are a number of places where we feel that, well, what we call the burning platform, well, why these things are important to you, particularly with respect to recalls and noncompliance. So you see some of the compelling reasons why you really don't want this stuff to get out of hand. And one of the big ones, of course, is shareholder value decline for those of you who are public companies. That can be pretty dramatic. I mean, in the case of the Peanut Corporation of America, of course, they went bankrupt. That dramatic. But there is often financial and brand impact, regardless of whether you're public or not. And in some cases, that kind of effect can last for years afterward. I'm sure you all remember the Tylenol crisis, what, 20 years ago was it? And how long it took Tylenol to get back where it had been, through absolutely no fault of their own, none whatsoever. It was adulterated in the store. Nevertheless, to the extent you can prevent the long-term effects, you need to consider that. So, for example, things like social media. Monitor what's going on out there, what people are saying on Twitter and Facebook. And if you see anything about your products, be sure that you're on top of it. Be sure you're releasing information to counter whatever's out there. There are consumer and customer impacts as well. Health fears are all over the place. Consumers will avoid brands post-recall. They'll avoid one brand even though that brand was not affected. It was the next brand to it on the shelf if the product is similar or the same. You also have the risk of price increases. Some insurers are beginning to raise their premiums on food manufacturers seen as risky. So, for example, seafood or meat or dairy or others of that kind. And of course, we have constant media attention now in a way that simply didn't exist not very long ago, primarily due to the fact that the internet is everywhere and social media are also everywhere to a large degree. And finally, you have the actual Fsma impacts: suspension of registration, expanded emergency records access, remote access to food safety plans, and new traceability requirements. Those are just 4. There are others as well. Next slide, please. Where can we help you comply with Fsma? There are actually several different areas. In the column on the left there, the one you see at the moment, you see basic requirements, which apply to almost every food company, and indeed to many companies in the food chain, even if they're not food manufacturers themselves. So, for example, there are testing laboratories that have new requirements. So they have to be certified in order to test certain products that the FDA will required. Next build, please. The middle column there applies to larger and more complex companies, but still making approximately the same products. And the final build, please. And the third column to larger and more complex companies that also manufacture products that are sort of inherently problematic. So in that category, we would normally talk about meat, dairy, seafood, and fresh produce. All of those are, let's say, more easily naturally contaminated than, say, a chocolate bar, and therefore require a degree of attention above and beyond what a chocolate manufacturer would ordinarily have to exercise. And across the bottom of the slide there, you see in red some of the things we think are most likely to be helpful to you. And of course, the core product that SAP offers, the ERP product, or what we call ECC, is kind of fundamental to everything else. But we'll be talking about a couple of other ones here, and in particular, we'll be talking about global batch traceability. That's the second column, GBT. We'll be talking briefly about quality management and several others down there that we think it would be wise for you to have a good close look at to be sure, again, you're in compliance. The next slide. And then this is just the setup slide. We're going to be talking now briefly, again, about master data management and global data synchronization. And why don't you go ahead, one more slide, one more, and one more. Stop there. This is, oops, back one, sorry. This is where you see the master data that you're going to need for anything you're doing with the FDA, essentially. You have to be able to uniquely identify every material you've got and be sure that wherever it is, you're able to link it up to all the other things that are part of the system. That is, you've got to use the same name no matter where where it is, whether it's at your vendor, whether it's in your supplies, whether it's out to your customer, or wherever. You have to be able to link all those different pieces of data together. And that may imply not just master data management, but something like global data synchronization, so something to pay attention to. Next slide, please. Here we see SAP's PLM system, PLM standing for Product Lifecycle Management. And PLM essentially ensures that as you develop a new product, you will be sure to include all the information you're going to need for the FDA and for Fsma, as well as many other things like costs. So things like allergen information and labeling information and formula optimization, being sure that you design a formula that's the least expensive for what you want, and a number of business benefits that apply there. So this one is likely to be of great use to you as you work on meeting the FDA requirements. Next slide, please. Again, here we're talking about global batch traceability, and go on to the next one. Well, what is it about? What is global batch traceability and lot genealogy and so forth? What is that all about? Well, we're trying to define every piece of information necessary from farm to fork so that the FDA can quickly and easily track anything that is reported to be questionable and can do it in a hurry. And we have a couple of different ways to do that. So next slide. We have 2 solutions, and they're called the batch cockpit and global batch traceability. What's the difference between them? The batch cockpit is inside SAP's ERP or ECC basic system. And if you implement it for batch management, you can see all of the information that you need to track and trace materials throughout your own system. However, it doesn't go outside the SAP basic ERP system. It doesn't look at other instances of SAP. It doesn't look at, for example, your vendor's information, or if you have a manufacturing execution system or a warehousing system that does palletizing and other things of that sort, the data may not be available. So on this chart, you see the differences between the two. Both Batch Cockpit and GBT will do the top-down and bottom-up analysis, and you're about to see that in just a moment. However, if you have a large, complex, global organization with many different elements, many different implementations of software, many different plants, that kind of thing, you're probably going to need more. And for example, do you have non-SAP data, the fourth item down there? Well, if you do, if you've got data out there that's got to be part of your global batch track and trace, and yet it's not on SAP systems, the Batch Cockpit won't handle it. If you have pallets, if you have broken links in the chain of information, things like that, that will push you toward global batch traceability. What we're going to show you today is the fundamental system, that is the global batch track and trace. And for that, I'm going to turn you over to Dan Chervenka to actually show you that program. Dan?
Okay. My name is Dan Chervenka. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer with Yash Technologies. And this demonstration will focus on the track and trace capability that's within the CPG-1, which is Yash's all-in-one solution pre-configured for the consumer packaged goods industry. And this is a little bit about CPG-1. You see it is a SAP Business All-in-One. It's pre-configured and pre-packaged. And it's delivered fixed cost, scope, and duration. And it's based on the best practices provided by SAP, localized for the USA, and uses accelerated implementation methodology called SIMPLE. I'd like to set up my demonstration here a bit, and this is a slide you saw earlier from Steve. And the main area that I'm going to be focusing on is the first highlighted area there, track and trace. And you'll see that in somewhat detail. And then that capability and the information gathered from that is what would be used to do the recall execution. Here's a graphic of a typical example going from left to right of a product flow through a company. Typically starts with purchases of raw materials that are going to go into the manufacturing process. And in a track and trace environment, all material going into the product is going to be batch traced and batch tracked. And what you see here is an example of a couple of purchases coming in with batch numbers on them, like batch 100, batch 101. And those are go into inventory and then will be withdrawn and used in a production process to make, in this example, is a semi-finished product. And it's created batch 200. Then that batch goes into another semi-finished product, in this example, along with another batch of something else, creating batch 300, which is a semi-finished batch, which then goes into the finished product, a couple other batches of other ingredients going in to create the final finished product, batch 400, which in our example shows that it goes to 3 different customers. So the idea here is to be able to track this all the way through to see where everything came from and where everything went. Okay, so to do the demonstration, I'm going to show this process, and as you can see, it goes bottom up here from the vendor. That's where all process starts, all the way to the top where product goes to the customer. So what happens here is, let's say we have a claim that came in from one of our customers, Smith & Son, and they're saying that they have an issue with this low-fat cottage cheese, and they even can tell us that the lot number that's on that is or batch number that's on it is batch number 778. So what we might do is we might do some analysis, maybe based on the information they give us. We know what it is, or we might have to do some testing. But in that process, we determine that the problem is the pineapple that we originally got from a supplier, a pineapple supplier. So there's, let's say, call it tainted pineapple. I'll refer to that as we go through here. So we have some tainted pineapple that went into that finished goods batch of the low-fat cottage cheese. So the process here then is to take that and answer 5 questions. So the 5 questions that need to be answered, first of all, is how much of that tainted low-fat cottage cheese batch 778 is still on hand and needs to be quarantined, because we may not have shipped the entire batch to that customer. So we need to understand, is there any of that on hand now that needs to be quarantined? Second question, what amount of tainted pineapples, the raw fruit, is still on hand and needs to be quarantined? We may not have used all of that tainted in current production, and so we need to identify any of that on hand to quarantine it. The third question is, what other customers received any products containing the tainted pineapples and need to be contacted? So that tainted pineapple might not have only gone into batch 778 of finished goods, might have gone into others, so we need to identify that so we know who to contact. Fourth question is, what other finished goods or semi-finished goods still on hand contain the tainted pineapples? So it might have gone into other semi-finished goods that have gone other directions, and we need to understand that. And then finally, what vendor delivered the tainted pineapples and on what date, so the vendor and the FDA can be notified of the issue. So those are the questions that we're going to answer as we go through the demonstration. So we start off with the claim. We know the problems with the pineapple. So what we'll do is we'll do a top-down and identify, as you see down here on the bottom left, the actual batch of pineapple. Could be more than one batch, but in this example, one batch of pineapple is the issue and is tainted, and that's going to be the batch that we're going to have to trace everywhere it went. So to do that, we would trace up then from that batch to see where it went. And the example that I have here, and we'll see this in the demonstration, that two finished goods batches have been identified, and also what we'll see is that they go to 3 different customers. Okay. Now, the other thing we're going to have to identify is any other batches, or all of the batches, we'll call it, that tainted pineapple went into. And as you notice here, not only the 778 and 779 went to customers, but I have a batch 777, which we'll see as we get in demonstration, is a semi-finished product that we have to trace also. And then finally, down on the bottom here, who is the supplier that supplied this tainted pineapple on what PO and what date, and we'll see that in the demonstration. So what we'll do now is we'll go into the batch cockpit. And you see here, this is a selection screen. And what we can do is you can put in what you know. So if you know the product number, you can put that in. Actually, we know a more finite piece of information. We not only know the product, we know the batch of that product that was affected. So what we'll do is we'll start from there. And we'll bring up a screen here that shows the information we just put in based on batch. From a batch standpoint, we can look at it, or from a stock standpoint. So from there, let's go ahead and look at the stock standpoint, because that was the first question we had. How much of the tainted low-fat cottage cheese batch 778 is still on hand and needs to be quarantined? And what we see is I'm looking down through the stock, and I see that we only have that batch for that finished goods product on hand, batch 778, and we see that 445 is the quantity that's on hand of that cottage cheese that was alerted to us by our customer. So that 445 then now is going to be a candidate to be quarantined. So that answers question number 1. Now, if I go ahead and just click on that and say I want a top-down analysis, okay, what it'll do now is it'll take that batch and explode it down to everywhere that batch went. So in our example here, we see that finished goods batch went into one production order, which created, it actually created that batch, but it used actually 3 batches of ingredients. You use pineapple syrup, pineapple pulp, and the bulk cottage cheese. Now, the issue is with the pineapple, okay, not the syrup, it's the pineapple. So we see that pineapple pulp that was created as a semi-finished product came out of that production order, and it used that raw batch that we saw earlier. That's the raw batch that of pineapple that's tainted, and we got it on this purchase order. Okay, so what we want to find out is question number 2, what is the amount of tainted pineapples that are still on hand? So we know this batch 775 is tainted. So what we can do is we'll just double click on that, and then we'll drill into the inventory position for that batch 775. And I see that batch 775 has 9,990 pounds of that pineapple still on hand. So that 9,990 pounds is going to need to be quarantined so it can be analyzed to determine what the issue is with that. So that answers question number 2, what amount of tainted pineapples are still on hand and need to be quarantined. Okay, so from here what we can do is we can do a bottom up of that tainted pineapple. And as we explode that, now we're looking bottom up, and we see that pineapple went into this production order, which created this semi-finished product called pineapple pulp. That pineapple pulp went into actually 2 production orders here. Okay, that went into 2 production orders, which ended up creating 2 different finished goods lots of low-fat cottage cheese. Okay, one of them is the lot 7 or batch 778 that we were alerted to by our customer, and that was customer 1000 here. We'll see that in a minute. And we see that it also went to 2 other customers. Okay, so now we've identified question number 3: what other customers received any products containing the tainted pineapples and need to be contacted? And at any time we can just go in here and double click on any of these. So if we go on this one here, we knew the other customer was Smith & Sons. So if I double click on here, I can drill in, and it shows me the delivery, this delivery number, and I can see that it went to Hendricks Markets with a quantity of 30 eaches, which these are 20-ounce tubs of cottage cheese. And I can click on the contact information, and it gives me who they are, where they are, and their telephone number to execute the contact. Okay, and we could do that for all 3 of these customers to contact. So now question number 3 is answered. Who are all the customers that receive product containing the tainted pineapple? All right, so now what we can do is we can say, all right, we want to identify the 4th question: what other finished goods or semi-finished goods still on hand contain the tainted pineapple? And as we see that tainted pineapple went into this pineapple pulp. So right there is a candidate. That's a semi-finished goods that's now tainted. We may still have some on hand. So if we go ahead and take, like we did before, look at the inventory position, we see that batch 777, we have 800 pounds of that pineapple pulp on hand. So that's now going to need to be quarantined. The others, which we haven't looked at, we looked at 778. We haven't looked at 779. We know we have 445 of 778 from our earlier inquiry. Now we need to see what do we have of this lot 779. So we drill into the inventory position of that, and I see now I have 260 eaches, because this is now a finished goods, low-fat cottage cheese. I have 260 eaches with that batch number on it that need to be quarantined. So that answers the 4th question: what other finished goods or semi-finished goods still on hand contain the tainted pineapple? Okay, the final question is, who is the supplier? So I'm going to do a top-down from that tainted pineapple batch, and I see it was received on this purchase order. And if I drill into the purchase order, I can see that that purchase order came from, see it in a second here, from purchase order 487 from ABC Supply. And if I need to contact information for ABC Supply, I can drill that in and see that who they are, where they are, and their telephone number. Okay? So let's go ahead back to our presentation. And what I see here, and we're just going to review our questions that we had earlier, is how much of the tainted low-fat cottage cheese batch 7078 is still on hand, and we identified 445 eaches of 778 need to be quarantined. The second question we asked is what amount of tainted pineapples are still on hand and need to be quarantined. So the raw pineapples, batch 775 had 9,990 pounds. What other customers received any products with the tainted pineapples? And we see we had those three, Hendricks, Marcus, Smith & Sons, and ABC Groceries. And we can see the quantities that were on the deliveries of those tubs of cottage cheese and the batch numbers. What other finished goods or semi-finished goods still on hand? And we noticed that when we went through that we had the pulp, 800 pounds of pulp, and 260 eaches of low-fat cottage cheese in a different batch. And then finally, who is the vendor that we received the tainted pineapples from, and that was ABC Supply. The order was for 10,000 pounds, and we received it on 1/28/2013. So what you saw as we revisit this, my particular example only had 2 levels of production in it. But what you saw, what I did here, we saw the purchase order through the production process to the deliveries that went out to customers, and then we traced back and forward through that. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Steve.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Go on to the next slide there. Now back to the global batch traceability for a couple of more moments. You saw already that all the data necessary to do the lot, track, and trace that the FDA, most of the data the FDA requires are a couple of new things, but by and large, what you just saw is what the FDA wants to know. And if they're standing there at your elbow saying, well, what do we do next? You saw that in a matter of minutes, you were able to trace a suspect lot of material all the way through the manufacturing process, all the way out to all the customers that received it, and all the way back to the vendor who supplied it, very, very quickly. But that was a deliberately simple environment there, all within a single company, essentially, and all the data right there in a single SAP system. However, that's not always the case, depending on the, well, I'll say size, but it's actually complexity of your operations. You may have data scattered around in a lot of different places. And in the slide you're looking at right now, the functions up there at the top are the ones you just saw, most of them. The last one there, and that last couple, maintaining batch links and performing mass processing, really apply to large and complicated ones. But most of them are just as you saw, except where did the data come from? And down toward the bottom, you see the data could have come from lots of different places. So an ERP system, an SAP ERP system in Europe or EMEA somewhere, a couple more than the United States that are here in the U.S., suppliers' ERP systems, warehouses, third-party batch record systems, all over the place, not to mention manufacturing execution systems and other places as well. So the more complex your corporation, your company, the more likely you are to need something not functionally different, but simply with a broader scope than what you just saw. Next slide, please. And this is to give you an idea of what it might look like if you're bigger and more complicated. You've identified in the red box in the middle the problematic batch lot, whatever it is that needs to be traced. And you see that going toward the right, it's not all that complicated. Some of it went one direction up toward the upper right, and some of it went down to perhaps one distribution warehouse and maybe a bunch of different stores of a single vendor. Of course, it could have been much more complex than that. Over to the left, you see that the material, the incoming material, might have come from lots of different places as well. So depending on details, you're going to have to, you may have a very large and complex graphical representation here. The primary difference between what you saw a moment ago and this sort of representation is that here you can simply click on the nodes and track it with a single click, and it automatically explodes backward and forward all of the possible places something might have come from, and you can just trace it right through the system quite rapidly. The data, however, is collected automatically by this system from all the different sources, some of which we saw a moment ago, brought into a single database whose sole purpose is to do track and trace. And typically it runs in memory rather than on a hard drive to make it faster still. And the whole point is, if you've got a very large, very complex corporation that's spread out all over, well, company, more than one corporation, spread out all over the globe, you're going to need something that can handle that level of complexity and do it in 1 or 2 seconds. You can't wait a month to figure this stuff out. So that's the essential difference between these two products. Functionally, they're both very similar. It's a question of scope. Next slide, please. I hope that gave you a fairly clear idea of what we're calling on the slide here, global batch traceability. It's actually batch track and trace of any kind. The next issue we want to mention is reporting and analytics. It is clear that you're going to need some fairly decent reporting and analytics to pull the data you need from your systems, whatever they may be, so that you can pass that data on to the FDA and others, both up and down the food chain, quickly and easily. We're not going to make a recommendation there, simply warn you there's likely to be more of both of those, so be sure you're covered. Next slide. There are also underlying requirements, and here we call out perhaps the most important, which is quality issue management. A good quality management system in the plant is going to be very important. There are some specific things in the new law. For example, certain testing, particularly of high-risk materials like food and shellfish and produce, are going to require that the tests be done by a certified lab, not your own internal lab, unless your lab happens to be certified. You may have to send stuff out to a laboratory to get it properly tested. You're going to have to track it on its way out and on its way back. The results, all of that stuff, all has to be tied together. So now we're having not just the materials themselves as they flow along the food chain, but documents that apply to those materials also have to be at your fingertips, and you have to do more testing than you had to do in the past. So you want to have a look at how you handle quality management in your plant or plants and be sure that it's up to snuff. And finally, next slide, we believe there's going to be, oh, there, I'm sorry, I missed the quality issue management slide, pardon me. I already said all those, so you can have a look at them later on if you wish. Next slide. Finally, there may be a requirement for mobility. That is, you can make a lot of things, for example, on plant floor, a lot easier using mobile devices than if you have to, run upstairs to the computer every time you need to enter some data. That's not required by law, but we think that mobile devices are pretty much the wave of the future, both here and handling not just Fsma, but a lot of other things as well. Well, that concludes our comments for today. I thank you very much, and I guess would like to open it for questions now.
Well, Steve and Dan, I'd like to thank you both. You provided us with a wealth of information around FSMA. We have some time to answer questions, and we've received a couple since we've begun the webinar. This kind of goes back to Dan and the demo. Is there any limit to the number of levels which this cockpit can track, Dan?
No, there's not. As you can see that when we showed the batch cockpit, it was actually just exploding to the actual data, the information that was captured at the time the events happened, and just displaying them out on the screen. So there is no limit to the number of levels, the number of batches, the number of purchase orders, production orders that would be displayed there. There's no limits whatsoever.
And the same is true of the global batch traceability product. I hope that graphic gave you a sense that it could have gone for, a mile and a half in either direction.
Okay. And I guess you kind of answered the next question. How quickly after the claim and problem identification is this information available? Or, does it have to be built after the fact?
All online in both cases. So as fast as your data is flowing through your system, it is available for track and trace in either system. Now with global batch traceability, the data is actually collected by the program. So as the data becomes available, it is sort of sucked out of the system where it originated and stored in this database. But we're still talking about times, like a millisecond or two to bring that data together. Nothing you could see. Whereas with the batch cockpit, you're working directly with the data online, live data. You're seeing it as you're working.
Okay. which kind of leads into the next question, Steve, around the historical. How is this data being maintained historically? I guess the first, is it, and how available is the data?
Yeah, that's somewhat different for the two systems. First, I'll describe the global batch traceability, and then ask Dan to answer it for the batch cockpit. In the case of the global batch traceability system, the data is being pulled from other sources all over the world and being stored in a single central database. And it's there forever. So you cannot delete data from that central database. If there are changes or errors to the original data, when you receive a change notice or an erratum from somewhere, it will sort of overlay the original one. But you will see that data. You'll see, here's the original record. Nope, right underneath it, this was the change. Ignore the earlier one. This is the one that you care about. And, of course, the program takes that into account. But the data is permanent. You may have to, depending on the materials you're talking about, you might have to go back, months or even years in some cases, depending on what kinds of products are involved. Dan?
Yeah, on the global batch cockpit, it works a little bit differently from the change standpoint. Is that, again, like Steve said, the data is not maintainable. You just can't go in and change something on the data. So if somewhere along the way an error was made in a transaction, like a batch or a quantity, whatever it was, to fix the problem, what you'd need to do is you reverse the transaction you originally did and then redo the transaction in the system. And then what happens is all that information, all that history is captured in the system of the original erroneous transaction that was made, the reversal, and then the transaction that was done correctly. So that's everything that's done in the system is captured exactly how it's done. And as far as the length of time, there's really no limit to how long you can keep the data. It's available for as long as you want to keep it and accessible to the batch cockpit.
Okay.
One more quick comment there about the global batch traceability system, the GBT, is that because the data is now being stored in a separate database, there are always links back to the original source of the data, wherever it came from. It sometimes happens that those links get broken because a server is down or something of the kind. And global batch traceability has built-in error correction of that type. So now all we're saying is, I know where the data came from, but I can't get there anymore to see the original source data. I've still got the record, but I can't see the original record that the GBT record was based on. So it is characteristic of the Internet that every now and again you can't get where you were, day before yesterday. The system automatically handles that. You've still got the data available. You can still do complete traceability, but to go back to the source records, you have to wait for the repair mechanism to kick in.
That's a great point, Steve, and thanks for the clarification. Steve, from a compliance perspective, what penalties, either civil or even criminal, can the FDA levy on companies?
Well, that's one of the biggest differences now. The FDA has not just power, but has sanctions that were, in the past, well, minor to put it mildly, so that it almost encouraged people to ignore regulations because the penalties were really, by and large, pretty small. Well, as you've seen in that Sunland case that I mentioned earlier, the penalties have been, notched up a lot. There are not just things like plant closings, which are bad enough to begin with, but there are also civil penalties and even criminal penalties if they believe there was fraud involved or malfeasance or any of a number of things like that. They can bring criminal charges against both the company and individuals. Finally, there are, what I'll call sort of inspection penalties. That is, when the FDA comes to see you, if you've got everything ready and they chug right through it and say, everything looks just great, thanks very much, we will see you in either 3 years or 5 years, depending on whether you're a high-risk company or a relatively low-risk company. Although their visits are unannounced, they're required by law to visit you on either every 3 years or every 5 years, depending on details. If, however, they were not satisfied with what they found and they have to come back, you're going to be paying for their time, and it runs to a lot of money very quickly. If they have to come back 2 or 3 times, you're talking about a lot of money. It's not it's sort of like a charge rather than a penalty. But you're paying for their time then. So it's not like it used to be. It's going to be deliberately a lot more expensive than it was to skirt the regulations.
Okay. Well, Steve and Dan, thanks again for this valuable insight and information. We don't have any more questions. So ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webcast for today. A link to watch a replay of this event will be emailed out shortly. Again, I want to thank you all for attending, and please note the contact details on your screen in the event you need to reach out to us further. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.